Russia and Ukraine as well?
Yeah, I'll give you an update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay?
What if Trump just became Putin's worst nightmare? Just weeks ago, the world watched as Trump seemed to bend to Putin's demands, abandoning Ukraine and blocking military aid. So what happened now? In a stunning reversal, Trump has made a move that could change everything. Sources close to the White House reveal a dramatic shift in strategy, one that could leave Moscow scrambling. Was this the plan all along, or has Trump finally seen through Putin's games? Let's find out. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's highly anticipated visit to the White House on Friday took a dramatic and damaging turn, leaving U.S.-Ukraine relations in a precarious state. What was meant to be a strategic discussion on continued support for Kyiv devolved into a public confrontation after Vice President J.D. Vance engaged in a heated exchange with Zelensky in front of the press. The tense altercation overshadowed the meeting and further strained an already fragile alliance. This incident comes amid growing concerns over President Donald Trump's recent concessions to Russian leader Vladimir Putin, moves that have so far yielded no tangible benefits for the United States.
In a sudden reversal, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he is now considering sanctions and tariffs against Russia as it ramps up attacks against Ukraine. Trump made the announcement via Truth Social, pushing the two sides to reach a peace agreement, saying, quote, to Russia and Ukraine, get to the table right now before it's too late.
But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards.
Just last week, Trump met with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky during a contentious exchange as Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance scolded Zelensky for not being thankful enough. As Zelensky explained, Russian President Vladimir Putin failed to honor a ceasefire agreement with him in 2014 to end the fighting in Crimea.
The fallout from February 28th marks a significant setback for Ukraine and a worrying development for U.S. national security. Analysts warn that if Ukraine is forced into a disadvantageous peace deal or suffers defeat on the battlefield, the consequences could extend far beyond its borders. A Russian victory would encourage the Kremlin, increasing the threat not only to Europe, but also to American interests in the long term. The situation has left European leaders scrambling to reassess their strategy, with many now questioning whether Washington remains a reliable partner in supporting Ukraine's defense. During emergency talks on Sunday, European officials met with Zelensky to explore ways to salvage Western unity and re-engage the U.S. in meaningful dialogue. However, with President Trump showing little willingness to reverse course, there is growing anxiety over the possibility of a complete withdrawal of American aid. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Washington last week with cautious optimism, carrying a proposed deal that would grant the United States a strategic advantage in developing Ukraine's vast rare earth mineral reserves, an offer designed to capture President Donald Trump's attention. The groundwork for negotiations had seemingly been laid earlier in the week, with French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer meeting Trump to discuss potential pathways to ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Initially, the White House meeting proceeded smoothly, but tensions erupted after an extended press briefing when Vice President J.D. Vance, who has previously dismissed Ukraine's fate as inconsequential, launched a surprise verbal attack on Zelensky.
President Volodymyr Zelensky protested his country's exclusion from the peace talks. Things began to get a little personal.
So unfortunately, President Trump, who we respect a lot as a leader of the nation, unfortunately, he lives in this disinformation space.
Despite Zelensky's genuflecting in his preamble, Trump took serious offense to the suggestion that he is incorrect in his assessment of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian, a dictator without elections.
The confrontation quickly escalated, leaving the talks in disarray. Observers noted Vance's visible satisfaction as the meeting collapsed, with Trump abruptly canceling a planned lunch and the rare earth minerals agreement left unsigned. In a stunning breach of diplomatic protocol, Zelensky was reportedly asked to leave, marking one of the most humiliating moments in recent U.S. foreign policy history. The public snub of a key ally, one that has endured 3 years of brutal Russian aggression, would be alarming on its own, but it takes on even darker significance when viewed alongside the Trump administration's recent concessions to Moscow. Over the past 3 weeks, the White House has repeatedly aligned itself with Russian interests, often at Ukraine's expense. On February 12th, Trump openly suggested that Ukraine would not regain all its occupied territories or join NATO, effectively endorsing 2 of Putin's key demands before negotiations had even begun. That same day, he broke with Western allies by announcing plans to meet Putin, despite the diplomatic isolation imposed on Russia since its 2014 annexation of Crimea. By February 13th, Trump had further distanced himself from the G7 consensus, advocating for Russia's reinstatement into what was once the G8. Days later, he made the baseless claim that Ukraine had provoked the war, a false narrative long pushed by the Kremlin. The pattern continued as U.S. officials reportedly blocked a G7 statement condemning Russian aggression on the 3rd anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion. Then, in a move that shocked international observers, the U.S. joined Russia, North Korea, and Iran in voting against a UN resolution that accurately identified Moscow as the aggressor in the conflict. Despite this steady drift toward Putin's positions, the administration has yet to secure a single tangible concession in return. When pressed during a recent interview, Trump's lead negotiator, billionaire Steve Witkoff, failed to name any Russian compromises, or even any that the U.S. had requested. The fallout from Zelensky's disastrous White House visit has left U.S.-Ukraine relations in crisis with little immediate hope of repair. While some hoped that seasoned officials like Secretary of State Marco Rubio or National Security Advisor Mike Waltz might steer policy back toward a more balanced approach, both have instead echoed the administration's harsh reality toward Kyiv. Zelensky, for his part, insists the partnership can still be salvaged, but rebuilding trust will be an uphill battle. The broader question now is whether Trump's apparent eagerness to engage Putin will yield any real progress or simply encourage further Russian aggression. Thus far, the Kremlin has offered nothing in exchange for Washington's concessions, suggesting Putin is content to wait for more. Meanwhile, with U.S.-Ukraine relations at a breaking point, the risk of intensified Russian military strikes looms large. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted a critical meeting of European leaders with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday, resulting in a unified strategy to counter Russia's aggression while preparing for the possibility of diminished American backing. The leaders agreed on several key measures: sustaining military aid to Ukraine, increasing economic pressure on Russia, ensuring any peace deal safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty, and involving Kyiv directly in negotiations. Additionally, they pledged to bolster Ukraine's defense industry and explore forming a coalition of the willing, potentially including troop deployments, to guarantee security commitments. Starmer emphasized the importance of U.S. involvement, noting that Britain, France, and Ukraine would present their joint plan to Washington in hopes of salvaging transatlantic cooperation. Yet concerns linger about the recent Oval Office confrontation between Zelensky and Vice President J.D. Vance, marked by abrupt hostility and a canceled agreement on Ukrainian rare earth minerals, may have been deliberate. The breakdown has forced European leaders to confront an unsettling reality. The U.S., under President Donald Trump, appears increasingly willing to sideline Ukraine in favor of warmer ties with Moscow.
The Russians have mocked him, demonstrated they have this. There's been more than enough times in the last few months where the Russians have mocked him, demonstrated they have zero respect for him, and continue to increase what they're doing against innocent Ukrainians. And the president still fails to do anything. So what's really crazy here is that anybody thinks that he is going to do something serious. I think the only thing that will push him to action is going to be if the Republican Party when they realize that they own this total failure of American foreign policy, that the senior Republicans in the House and Senate are going to be held accountable, and then they start putting pressure on Donald Trump. Otherwise, of his own accord, I would say zero.
With Washington's commitment in doubt, Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have assumed leadership of a European effort to stabilize support for Kyiv. While repairing the U.S.-Ukraine relationship remains the preferred outcome, contingency planning is now essential. The stakes could hardly be higher. Should Trump refuse to re-engage with Zelensky, halt military aid, and pursue unilateral diplomacy with Putin, Europe and Ukraine would need to forge a self-sufficient partnership. European nations possess the economic strength to sustain Ukraine, but lack sufficient defense production capacity, a gap that could be offset by Ukraine's battle-tested military, which has spent 3 years holding back Russia's expansionist ambitions. One immediate step would be for the EU to finally unlock the estimated $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets, redirecting those funds to Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. Even if Trump withholds American weapons, European leaders might still negotiate arms sales, appealing to the president's transactional instincts. A more troubling question looms over NATO. Vance's dismissive rhetoric toward Ukraine at the Munich Security Conference, combined with Trump's long-standing skepticism of the alliance, raises fears that the U.S. security guarantee may no longer be reliable. While NATO remains foundational to transatlantic stability, recent actions, from Trump's repeated concessions to Putin to his administration's refusal to condemn Russian aggression at the UN, suggest a stark departure from traditional U.S. leadership. European members and Canada must now weigh whether to accelerate defense integration independent of Washington. The coming weeks will test whether diplomacy can mend the rift between the White House and Kyiv. But as Trump prepares for potential direct talks with Putin, don't you think Russia's leader has given nothing in return for American goodwill while Ukraine survives?